The history of indigenous peoples in the United States is a history of both transformation and tradition. It's a long story of adaptation to new environments and new realities. As people moved into new lands, neighbors came and went, the climate and environment transformed, new technologies were developed, and geopolitical landscapes shifted. But it's also a story of continuity, as people look to their elders, histories, and traditions to guide them moving forward. It's a story of incredible technological and social innovation, built on careful observations of the world and always done for the greater good and longevity of entire communities. It's a story of deep connections to homes both old and new, where landscapes were not left untouched, but expertly managed both to the maximum benefit of humanity and the sustainable health of the ecosystem. It is a history that is as rich and vibrant as anywhere else in the world, and one that deserves to be much more well known. So without further ado, let's get into it. Welcome to Indigenous History Now, the channel where we explore the histories, cultures, and languages of the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere and parts of the Pacific. This video is going to start more hemispheric in scope, and then we're going to narrow in on just the lands of the United States. Canada, Mesoamerica, and South America are all going to get their own summary videos later. Also, this video is just going to focus on the continental United States. Even though they are part of the United States, the histories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are better told from a Caribbean or Mesoamerican perspective, and the histories of Guam, the Marianas, Hawaii, and American Samoa are all better told from a Pacific perspective, so those will all be stories for another time. Let's start with a quick but important note about terminology. This hemisphere is home to an incredible diversity of native peoples, all of whom have their own worldviews, practices, languages, and histories. Using one term to refer to all of these different peoples collectively, most of the time is too broad to be useful and frequently gives the false impression that native peoples are all one cultural monolith, which they certainly are not. If we're talking about a certain region or tribe, it's usually best to use specific tribal names, like Cherokee, Dene, Cree, etc. And if you're interacting with an indigenous person, most would prefer to use their own tribal affiliation like this. However, the last 500 years has seen a process of foreign colonization that pitted non-indigenous against indigenous without regard to indigenous cultural backgrounds. Given that we live in this context today, it is useful to have some pan-indigenous terms to describe that situation, so long as we remember when they are appropriate and when they are unhelpful. Now, I myself am not an indigenous person, so everything I'm about to say I've gotten through conversation with indigenous people, feedback in my comments section, or reading the writings of indigenous authors. In regards to a pan-indigenous identity, the terms you're most likely to see or hear are Native American, Indigenous American, and American Indian, or just Native, Indigenous, or Indian for short. Native American is not widely used by indigenous peoples themselves. It was a term coined by non-natives, it is mostly used by non-natives, and it is seen by many indigenous people as a bit of a white man's term. The shorthand of just Native is used by Native people, but the full Native American, not that much. American Indian has a somewhat divided opinion. For a while, it was the preferred pan-Indian term, at least here in the United States. Yes, we all know Indian is a misnomer because Columbus was bad at math and couldn't believe the Pacific really is just that big. But many indigenous Americans had adopted it and considered it acceptable. Lots of tribes use the term Indian in their tribal name and in tribal businesses. The US federal government still uses Indian in official documents, and many colleges and universities with Indigenous Studies programs use Indian. For example, my degree from the University of Washington is in American Indian Studies, and when I was there, I think all but 2 of the professors in the department were Indigenous, and it was a decent-sized department. However, this has changed in the last few decades, especially within the last 10 years or so. More and more Indigenous Americans are moving away from the term Indian, especially among younger generations, and there seems to be a growing discomfort with non-Indigenous people using the word. In the United States, there's still a difference of opinion. You'll still come across people who are fine with anybody using the word Indian, but there are those who aren't. I have also been told by a commenter that in South America, Indian is strongly dispreferred. However, I've also been told by others that Indian is the preferred term in South America, so I'm uncertain. If any Indigenous South American viewers can comment and let me know, that would be great. The term that has been gaining in popularity in recent years, and which is probably your best bet if you're uncertain what to use, is Indigenous American, or just Indigenous. Most people, both native and non-native, who are abandoning Indian are replacing it with Indigenous. Another term you may have seen is First Nations. This is the preferred term for most groups in Canada. It is exclusive to Canada, though. Nobody else uses it so far. So if you see or hear it being used, you can clock right away that they're talking about specifically Canadian Indigenous nations. However, not every Canadian Indigenous nation uses the term First Nations. It is not used by Inuit nor Métis. As you can see, there's a diversity of opinion on this topic, but as far as this channel is concerned, I will mostly use Indigenous American, Indigenous, or Native. I will use American Indian or Indian when it's in a quote, in an organizational name, or when it's part of a generally accepted term for which there isn't yet a generally accepted alternative like Indian country or urban Indian. In any other context, though, out of respect for the greatest number of people, I will avoid using that word. If you are Indigenous, please do weigh in on the topic down in the comments, and if you disagree with my assessment, I will definitely make adjustments. Alright, on with the show. We begin with the arrival of the first human inhabitants in the Americas. On this topic, most of you were probably taught the Bering Land Bridge theory in high school. It goes roughly as follows. Paleo-Indians first arrived around 13,500 years ago by crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into Alaska. From there, they took an ice-free corridor through the Canadian glaciers into the rest of North and South America, where they thoughtlessly hunted all the Ice Age megafauna to extinction. Unfortunately, almost all scholars for the last 20 years at least have agreed that this timeline is completely false, and the story itself is at best woefully incomplete. Numerous sites have been discovered all over the Americas as far south as Chile, pushing the date of human habitation in the Americas back from 13,000 years ago to at least 24,000 years ago, and many say even farther. Now, it is pretty clear that humans did cross from Siberia into Alaska. However, as far as getting into the rest of the continent, these dates pose a serious problem for an entirely overland crossing because the Canadian glaciers at that time would not have been passable. No ice-free corridor existed that long ago. Furthermore, if the majority of Paleo-Indians crossed overland from Siberia into Alaska, then overland again through Canada into the rest of the continent, we should expect to see the oldest sites in Alaska, and all other sites decreasing in age as you move south through Canada, through the lower 48, and into South America. But this is not what we see. We do have old sites in Alaska. The oldest currently accepted is Bluefish Caves at 24,000 years old. But we also have sites of equal antiquity south of Canada. The oldest currently is White Sands National Park, New Mexico at 23,000 years old. And what's more, the sites in the ice-free corridor are among the youngest in Pleistocene America. The oldest site in the ice-free corridor is only 12,500 years old. People had been living south of there for at least 10,000 years. Our best archaeology suggests that people moved north into the ice-free corridor from the south, not the other way around. Because of this, scholars since the 70s have increasingly come to adopt a sea route theory, positing that while ancient humans still came to the Americas from Siberia, they did so in boats traveling down the coastline. As the coasts were free of glaciers, and since water travel was by far the most efficient mode of transportation before widespread roads, this would have allowed Paleo-Indians to travel much farther, much faster than any land route. Oh, and given that indigenous people were in the Americas for at least 10,000 years before the megafauna went extinct, most academics now theorize climate change, not overhunting, drove the mammoth and others to extinction. After living as Ice Age hunter-gatherers, indigenous Americans in certain areas set down to the business of developing agriculture, independently domesticating wild plants into cultivated crops in several separate locations. The Andean coast, domesticating crops like potatoes, peanuts, tomatoes, and cotton, as well as llamas, alpacas, and guinea pigs, beginning around 10,000 BCE. This is as old as some of the first agricultural sites in Eurasia, and even older than many others. The Amazon basin, where manioc, also called cassava, was domesticated around 7,000 BCE. Mesoamerica, also beginning around 7,000 BCE with the domestication of beans, squash, cocoa, turkeys, and the heavy hitter, maize. And lastly, the eastern woodlands of the United States, in a zone approximately from Illinois to Florida. Here, beginning around 1800 BCE, indigenous Americans domesticated squash, different sorts from the Mesoamerican varieties, sunflower, and a few crops not so familiar today, namely goosefoot, little barley, and marsh elder. Agriculture developed independently in each of these sites, but eventually they would influence each other through contact and trade. The most impactful consequence of this was the spread of maize from Mesoamerica, the crop that would become the powerhouse of the hemisphere. Because of how much the ecosystems change as you move north and south, new variants of maize had to be continually developed everywhere it went, slowing the process down dramatically. But it still spread and completely transformed societies in its wake. It reached the Andes by 4000 BCE, the American Southwest sometime between 3500 and 2000 BCE, and at its furthest extent by 1000 CE was the principal crop under cultivation from southern Ontario all the way down to central Chile. Much more than just crop in-field farming, though, indigenous people throughout the hemisphere were masters of horticulture and sustainable land management. They utilized techniques such as controlled burning and advanced agroforestry to mold the environments around them. These practices are collectively known as silviculture. Evidence of controlled burning can be found pretty much wherever there were people. From Alaska to New York, Bolivia to the Mississippi, the Yucatan to the Great Plains, cultural burning, as it's called today, has been used for thousands of years to a variety of aims. It helped clear areas for cropland and travel routes. It could promote the growth of certain plant species, which in turn would attract more of certain animal species. In the Great Plains of North America and the Pampas and Llanos of South America, it was often used as a hunting technique to herd game into certain choke points, with the added benefit of rejuvenating the grass's growth cycle. Environments with a healthy mixture of old and new growth promote biodiversity, and periodic burning builds fire resilience in an ecosystem, thereby protecting against large, out-of-control wildfires. Not to mention that many plant and animal species have evolved to require fire for their reproduction. In many areas, fire was an aid to other ingenious strategies of horticulture and agroforestry. Not only would areas be burned then allowed to regrow naturally, often they were intentionally replanted with desired species. This was especially the case with trees. Through these methods, indigenous Americans could transform a wild forest into a managed orchard. In many areas, California, the eastern woodlands, the Pacific Northwest, the Amazon, we see incredible concentrations of resource-rich tree species as a result of these prescribed burn targeted replanting strategies. In the Amazon, for example, generally about 20% of tree species are edible, but in areas of known human habitation and management, that concentration jumps to 50%. And these aren't the sterile monoculture orchards evocative of modern palm oil plantations, but incredibly healthy and biodiverse ecosystems that we're still learning and benefiting from today. These sustainable yet highly productive practices supported large human populations. Estimates vary quite widely, and the debate can be rather bitter, but most put the population of the Americas at the time of European contact somewhere between 60 and over 100 million. Over half this number lived just in Mesoamerica and the Andes. Between 7 and 12 million lived north of the Rio Grande, and the same number lived throughout non-Andean South America, with another 2 to 5 million in the Caribbean. All these millions of people traveled and traded with one another regularly across continent-spanning trade routes. Evidence of long-distance trade routes connecting people hundreds of miles away from each other can be found even in the earliest sites in the hemisphere, like the 13,500-year-old Clovis site. Every corner of North and South America was linked together through trade. For thousands of years, and continuing right up through the colonial period, grizzly teeth from the Rockies made their way to Ohio, shells and shark teeth from the Atlantic found homes in North Dakota, bright bird feathers from tropical southern Mexico traveled to Arizona, Amazonian gold landed in the Caribbean, Mesoamerican obsidian sailed to Peru, etc. Almost all of this long-distance travel was done without any pack animals larger than dogs. Llamas, guanacos, and alpacas are used in the Andes, but they aren't found anywhere else. So outside the Andes, it was all by foot, dog, or water transport. I want to take a quick moment to rant for a sec and dispel a common myth. Wheels were a known technology in the Americas. They just weren't used for transportation. This is because wheeled transport really is not that practical unless specific conditions are met. First off, using wheels for efficient transport requires a pack animal, like a horse, cow, or ox, and the Americas didn't have any of these. Dogs can be, and were, used to pull small sleds, but they can't pull a cart that can hold any decent amount of cargo. So if you don't have a pack animal that can pull a cart, then your only option is for a human to pull it. And pulling a cart filled with cargo takes more effort for a person to do than just carrying that cargo on their back or a sled. This means everywhere outside the Andes, wheeled transport would have actually been less efficient than foot transport. Now, Andean societies did have pack animals capable of pulling a cart, but then you run into the second problem. Wooden wheels and axles break or get stuck really easily over rough terrain. Wheeled vehicles need smooth, firm surfaces to be any good. So they're really only useful if you have well-maintained roads with a smooth grade. Andean societies did keep well-maintained roads, but they went through very rugged mountains where constructing a grade smooth enough for wheeled vehicles would have just been more expensive than wheeled transportation was worth. And that's the really important point I wanted to end this rant on. If we're being completely honest here, the impact of wheeled transport on any pre-industrial society has been greatly exaggerated for a long time. People the world over have gotten along just fine and done magnificent things without wheels. No, I will not be elaborating. This video is not about wheels. If I piqued your interest, you can go look it up yourself. Now we're going to focus in on the lands of the United States. Indigenous Americans have a long history of city dwelling, urban architecture, and monumental construction, exemplified by the thousands of earthen mounds constructed throughout the eastern United States. These structures are gorgeous, often huge and technically impressive, and speak to a high level of social organization. The earliest of these mound sites are the LSU campus mounds on the grounds of Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. Construction started on these mounds in 9000 BCE, making them the oldest known man-made structures in all of the Americas. They were built up and used off and on over the next 5,000 years. We're not entirely certain what they were built for, but we're pretty sure they were ceremonial sites because there is evidence of animal cremation, and the mounds are aligned with the point where the star Arcturus, one of the brightest stars that can be seen from Earth, rose in the night sky at that time. The next oldest mounds are the Watson Brake Mounds in northeastern Louisiana, dating to around 3400 BCE. This is older than both Stonehenge and any Egyptian pyramid. There is evidence of continuous habitation at the site until around 2800 BCE, but why the mounds were built remains a mystery. There are no clear indications of ceremony, we haven't found any tombs, no astrological associations, no structures, we just don't know what they were used for. Next is Poverty Point, dating to around 1500 BCE, again in northeastern Louisiana. The main features here are a semicircle of 5-foot-tall concentric ridges, like a massive amphitheater almost 3/4 of a mile wide at the greatest extent. The ridges were topped with houses, and there were other structures all around the site. What's most fascinating about Poverty Point is that it was a full-blown city, supporting a population of up to 5,000 at a time before agriculture arrived in the region. So far as we can tell, these were urban hunter-gatherers. That is something that redefines traditional European notions of what makes a civilization, as agriculture is supposed to always come before cities. Following Poverty Point, the Hämäläinen society emerged in the upper Ohio River Valley from 800 to 100 BCE. Their mounds are tombs, hosting burials, likely of elite individuals, filled with grave goods, copper beads and bracelets, textiles, and sometimes stone smoking pipes carved as animals. Now for you astute listeners out there, yes, I did say copper beads and bracelets. Metallurgy in the Americas dates as far back as 6500 BCE, making it just as old or even older than the first emergence of metallurgy in Eurasia. It was first developed in the Great Lakes region, which has the largest deposits of natural copper in the world. This is copper so pure it can be worked without smelting. Consequently, indigenous Americans north of Mexico never developed smelting technology. Other natural copper deposits were worked in the Pacific Northwest, far northern Canada, and even a natural iron deposit in northern Greenland, likely from an ancient asteroid impact. Andean societies developed metallurgy independently around 2100 BCE, and unlike their North American counterparts, they did develop smelting. The technology spread to Mesoamerica in the early 7th century CE, and the two regions worked a variety of metals: copper, gold, silver, platinum, even smelting different metals together into alloys, though they never worked iron. Back to the mound builders. The Hämäläinen were succeeded by the Hopewell, who lived from 100 BCE to around 400 CE in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. These are probably the most widely known of the North American mound builders. Their most famous mounds are short, only about 5 feet high, but very large and constructed in elaborate shapes. One, for example, is a huge, mathematically perfect octagon the size of a football field. Another is a 1/4-mile long snake eating a disc. The snake, by the way, aligns with 8 different astronomical formations, so not only were they artistic, they were incredibly mathematically astute. After the Hopewells' decline in the 5th century, maize entered the region and gave birth in the 700s to the Mississippians. They occupied the shores of the Mississippi but also extended into the southeast, eventually serving as the cultural progenitors to many of the modern tribes of the region. They are most well known for their principal kingdom of Cahokia, the largest city north of Mexico. It had a population of between 14 and 18,000 at its height from 1100 to 1250. This is about the size that London was at the same time. It featured over 120 mounds in a 6-square-mile area, many the largest mounds north of the Rio Grande. The largest in the city is Monk's Mound, a colossal structure that stands 100 feet tall with a base larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Cahokia and all other Mississippian sites would eventually decline by the mid-1300s. Urban societies weren't limited just to the east, however. There's also the southwest, inhabited by the Hohokam of central Arizona, the Mogollon of western New Mexico, as well as northern Sonora and Chihuahua, and the ancestral Pueblo of the Four Corners region, more popularly known as the Anasazi. With regional variation of dates, but generally within the range of 0 to the 1500 CE, these peoples constructed large, technologically sophisticated cities from the sands of the desert, or sometimes out of the sides of cliff faces. They built huge urban apartment complexes capable of housing thousands of people and connected their towns with hundreds of miles of roads and irrigation channels, many of which are still in use today. One of these apartment structures, Pueblo Bonito, has up to 800 rooms. This is bigger than any apartment building was in Europe or the United States until 1882. On the plains, indigenous peoples in both the US and Canada constructed large henge-like sites known as medicine wheels. This is a practice with a long lifespan. The oldest site dates to 3500 BCE, and the youngest is less than 1,000 years old. They were used for religious ceremony as well as scientific inquiry, and many align precisely with astronomical formations. The Bighorn medicine wheel in Wyoming, for example, is capable of tracking the precession of the equinoxes, the moon's phases, lunar and solar eclipse cycles, and planets' orbital cycles, among other things. Let's briefly take a countrywide survey of what life was like for Indigenous American peoples on the eve of European contact. In the Northeast, nations such as the Wampanoag, Haudenosaunee, Abenaki, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Ojibwe lived in large villages and towns where they grew Three Sisters agriculture. That is, their primary crops were maize, beans, and squash grown together. This was supplemented by wild game. Some nations were semi-nomadic, seasonally migrating between inland hunting grounds and crop fields, and fishing grounds along the Atlantic coast or Great Lakes. These tribes tended to live in wigwams, which are circular structures capable of holding up to 3 families, made by bending over saplings and covering them with branches and furs. Other nations were more sedentary, spending all year in a large town surrounded by wooden palisades for defense. These tribes built longhouses, large rectangular buildings made from a wooden frame and bark covering. Northeast tribes observed a range of government structures, but the most common was having a village chief or sachem, usually but not exclusively male, that was appointed and accountable to a council of elders, which was mostly or entirely women. Northeast tribes tended to be matrilineal, so women held much power and played large roles in politics. In the Southeast, they too grew Three Sisters agriculture supplemented by game. As I mentioned before, most Southeast nations, like the Chickasaw, Catawba, Muskogee, Natchez, Copittacheki, and Yamasee, descended from the very socially stratified Mississippian culture, and traces of that old hierarchy could be seen in Southeast governments. Here, large chiefdoms or kingdoms headed by a hereditary monarch and ruling nobility were still around. Many nations were still building platform mounds topped with housing for the elites. Towns tended to be large and sedentary, protected by palisades. Housing varied widely in styles, from rectangular wattle and daub houses with thatched roofs to circular domed grass houses. The Great Plains of the 15th century was a very different place than the plains of the 19th century. Many of the modern plains nations that we see as quintessential representations of plains people, like the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, Lakota, and Kiowa, weren't plains nations in the 15th century. They lived in other parts of the continent. That isn't to say they had no connection to the plains yet, or never traveled to the plains to hunt. Some did. They just didn't live on the plains year-round. Those that did, like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, were farmers confined to the major riverways. But before horses were reintroduced in the 17th century, which we will talk about later, nobody lived full-time on the open plain. This was because the distances between water sources are just too great to be crossed on foot. People tended to skirt around the grass sea, following riverways rather than traversing very far straight into the open plain. The river-bound plains nations of the time lived in large sedentary towns and dwelt in earthen lodges. These structures tended to be circular, built of a wooden frame covered with earth and capable of holding up to 60 people. They supplemented their agricultural diet with game, so they were semi-nomadic. Teepees were used when a village was on the hunt and greater mobility was required. Bison hunting of this period was very dangerous, as it involved using humans disguised in animal skins to push and lure herds into designated areas, and then either stampede them over a cliff or into a gully or corral that served as a kill zone. Plains nations tended to be very decentralized and meritocratic. Positions of village head, shaman, or general weren't hereditary, but went to people who had proven their abilities. The Southwest was a very diverse place that housed both sedentary farmers and nomadic hunter-gatherers. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the ancestral Pueblo that I mentioned a few minutes ago moved out from their homes on the Colorado Plateau and migrated into the upper Rio Grande Valley. The Mogollon of southwest New Mexico also made this migration to the Rio Grande, and these two groups became the modern Pueblo peoples that we know today, like the Tiwa, Zuni, Hopi, and Acoma. They carried on their lives in very similar fashion to their ancestors, living in large sedentary towns built of adobe mud structures and growing the Three Sisters. The Hohokam of Arizona became the O'odham of today, who likewise continued farming the Three Sisters. They usually lived in small towns of round, semi-subterranean pit houses. Some O'odham groups lived along riverways, or close enough to use irrigation ditches, whereas others lived further in the desert and watered their crops purely with rainfall. The Southwest farmers tended to have governing structures similar to those seen in the Northeast, with a town council that chose a town chief and with women holding significant power. Among the Pueblo communities, most of the buildings and crop fields were owned by women. The Southwest nomads consisted of two main groups, the Apache and the Dene, whom most of you probably know as the Navajo. They were hunter-gatherers who supplemented their livelihoods by raiding the sedentary farmers. The Apache dwelt in what's called a wickiup. It's a round structure built of a wooden frame covered with grass or reed mats. The Dene eventually became more sedentary and began Three Sisters farming. After the Spanish introduced sheep in the 17th century, many Dene became pastoral shepherds. As a result of this transition, Dene began living in hogans, a cone-shaped house with a wooden frame covered in bark and earth. All of the farmers of the Southwest also grew cotton, so they spun and wove cotton clothing and later wool clothing and were very adept at textile art. The Apache and Dene were also recent arrivals to the Southwest. They both speak Athabascan languages, the vast majority of which are spoken in Alaska and northwest Canada. The Dene and Apache migrated south from there, arriving to their modern homes in the Southwest sometime between the 13th and 15th centuries. Some Apache bands first set up shop on the southern plains before later being driven out by the Comanche in the early 18th century. Now, the Southwest was by no means the only region to see large-scale migration in North American history. There are plenty of migrations to speak of in this continent's 20,000 plus years of habitation, but I'll give just a few more examples. First is the Cherokee, whose homelands are in southern Appalachia. They speak an Iroquoian language, but the highest concentration of Iroquoian languages is several hundred miles to the north in the eastern Great Lakes and St. Lawrence valleys. It's believed the Cherokee migrated south from this Iroquoian heartland beginning around 1500 BCE. On the west coast, there's a separate branch of Athabascan speakers who migrated to northwest California and southwest Oregon around 1000 CE. After the reintroduction of the horse, the Great Plains would see its fair share of immigrants, but we'll talk about that when we get there. For now, let's get back to the survey. The Great Basin is one of the most difficult areas to live in North America, probably only surpassed by the Arctic. It's very dry and resources are very scarce. Consequently, basin tribes like the Paiute, Ute, Washoe, Shoshone, and before they migrated east onto the plains, Comanche, were always nomadic hunter-gatherers. They stayed close to water sources which seasonally fluctuated with the rains, eating mostly game like pronghorns, deer, and ducks, as well as nuts, berries, and acorns, though in some places water was sufficient to allow Three Sisters farming. They traveled in groups no larger than extended families and only for brief periods under the right conditions aggregated into villages. Thus, formal governing positions like chiefs and councils weren't used. They usually dwelt in wickiups or similar portable structures like lean-tos and wove very skilled and artistic basketry. The Northwest Plateau region north of the Great Basin is similarly dry and sparse, but it's also cut by two of North America's largest river basins, the Fraser in Canada and the Columbia in the United States. Thus, tribes here, like the Klamath, Molalla, Nez Perce, Yakima, and Umatilla, had more resources at their disposal. They were hunter-gatherers, but only semi-nomadic, as their staple food of salmon required a storage economy. Their year revolved around the fall salmon runs when they would catch, preserve, and store huge quantities of fish. This would last about half the year, at which point they'd migrate elsewhere for spring and summer hunting. They also cultivated at least one crop, a type of lily called camas. Plateau tribes lived in villages with the chief and council structure we've seen in other places. Winter dwellings consisted of semi-subterranean circular pit houses and, in summer, rectangular longhouses of wooden frames covered with reeds. The West Coast has two of the most ecologically abundant and culturally diverse regions of North America, California and the Pacific Northwest Coast. California had the highest pre-contact population density north of Mexico, supporting all of these people without the need for agriculture. That's how rich the forests and waterways were. California tribes like the Wintu, Miwok, Yumi, Pomo, Chumash, and Kokopah were hunter-gatherers with storage economies, centered mainly around acorns, but also salmon. Acorns can be processed and dried into a flour and then made into breads, biscuits, cakes, etc. California nations lived in mostly sedentary towns, usually migrating between only 2 different town sites in a year. Again, the forests were so rich that they didn't need to move that much, but what's more, they were masters of the silviculture I described earlier. This also helped increase the forest's yields. California tribes dwelt in a wide range of housing designs, from cone-shaped slab houses, which had wooden frames overlaid with bark and reeds, to pit houses to wooden longhouses. The Pacific Northwest Coast was second only to California in population density and linguistic diversity. Northwest tribes like the Tlingit, Quinault, Makah, Tualatin, Siuslaw, Chinook, and Eyak can be accurately described as people of salmon and cedar. They were hunter-gatherers, but with salmon-centric storage economies. Anything you can think of materially, they could and did make out of the cedar tree, including comfortable and waterproof clothing. They lived in large, sedentary towns of permanent cedarwood longhouses. These were made of a wooden frame overlaid with planks. They were also similarly masterful silviculturists and also cultivated camas. Northwest Coast tribes did not have an egalitarian social structure. It was rigidly hierarchical and stratified based on wealth, lineage, and inheritance, though not gender. Women and men both could be high-status town leaders. Northwest Coast art is perhaps the most recognizable part of their culture and was among the most developed artistic traditions of the whole hemisphere. Up north, the subarctic zone of Alaska's interior and southern coast is dominated by the cold forests of the taiga. Here, tribes like the Atna, Tanana, and Quitchin were seasonally nomadic hunter-gatherers. Similar to the plateau farther south, conditions could have been significantly harder if not for rivers like the Yukon that bring salmon runs. As a result, subarctic tribes of Alaska kept permanent winter village sites of semi-subterranean pit houses where they would gather for salmon season. They would then splinter off into smaller family groups for summer hunting elsewhere. These villages were never very large, but many still had a council of elders for governance. Aside from fish, they hunted moose, caribou, beaver, and ducks, and harvested roots, berries, and sap. Heavy fur clothing, toboggans, snow goggles, snowshoes, and bone ice picks helped them navigate the forests through the long months of snow. Where the forests end is where the Arctic begins. The west and north coasts of Alaska are hard environments to call home, but tribes like the Yupik, Inupiaq, and Unangan do so anyway. The lack of trees and vegetation in general that defines the tundra and the high Arctic means Arctic peoples were heavily dependent on animal resources like seals, walruses, whales, and caribou for food, clothing, shelter, tools, and heat, in the form of burning whale or seal oil. On the coast of the Arctic Ocean, people practiced a seasonal round. Summer was spent on land hunting caribou and fishing the rivers and lakes, sleeping in portable skin tents. Winters, however, were spent hunting sea mammals on the pack ice and sleeping in igloos. All of this was done in small bands, usually only a few families in size, with no formal governance structure. However, life was different on the Bering Sea coast, which rarely freezes entirely. Thus, people there got almost all of their sustenance from the sea and built up winter food stores instead of continuing to hunt through winter like on the Arctic Ocean. They lived in seaside permanent villages of semi-subterranean wood and sod housing. A social hierarchy existed that did not exist in the north, with formal inherited chiefs and a class of nobility. Whether on the west or north coast, technology like kayaks and dog sleds helped people traverse the frozen expanses. Then, in 1492, natives in the Bahamas discovered a white man hopelessly lost at sea. Columbus was not the first European to reach the Americas. So far as we know, that honor goes to Leif Erikson's Vikings in the 10th or 11th century. But Columbus's voyage was the first to catch widespread attention back home. What followed was the greatest loss of life in human history, and the beginning of centuries of violent conquest and exploitation. Indigenous Americans had never encountered many of the diseases common in Eurasia, and as a result had no immunity. Thus, by 1650, the population of 60 to over 100 million had dropped by as much as 95%. Depending on population estimate, this puts the death toll in only 160 years at somewhere between 55 and 100 million. With a global population of only 500 million at the time, this means that up to 1 in 5 humans, 20% of the global population, died in a century and a half. Whole people groups were wiped out, and massive swaths of land were depopulated. Disease outbreaks would continue to ravage indigenous communities all the way up through the late 19th century. I'm going to go into more detail about the spread, impact of, and response to European diseases in other videos, but I do want to say a few things here. We in the United States, and I'm sure y'all do this in Europe as well, but I can only speak to the American experience, like to cope with our guilt of being culpable for this mass death by blaming all the destruction on a virgin soil effect and our ancestors' lack of medical knowledge. We like to throw our hands up and say this tragedy was sad, but ultimately unavoidable. As with almost everything, though, the reality is not so clean. First off, Europeans had plenty of experience dealing with epidemic diseases. They may not have understood the biology behind them, but they did know a thing or two about how they spread. They were familiar with mitigation techniques like quarantine that had proven track records of slowing or even stopping the spread of diseases, and they did have useful medicines. There were a few people with souls, like Bartolomé de las Casas, who called for colonial officials to put their European medical knowledge to use and manage their colonies in such a way as to limit the spread of disease, doing things like quarantines, enforcing better working and living conditions for indigenous laborers, sending European doctors and medicine to indigenous communities, etc. The efforts of people like Las Casas did result in some inoculation and medicine drives that were effective in reducing disease deaths amongst the native communities they treated. Unfortunately, Europeans like this were very much the exception to the rule. When most Europeans saw indigenous people dying in droves, knowing it was because of the diseases they had introduced, and knowing that they had effective medical knowledge at their disposal that they could use to help minimize the destruction, they did the exact opposite. They exploited the situation to expand their control even further over indigenous lands. Many colonial governments prohibited white doctors from offering medical care to sick natives. Many Europeans thanked God for disease outbreaks, seeing them as divine intervention, clearing the way for European colonization. Some disease outbreaks may even have been intentionally spread by Europeans. We don't know for certain that anybody actually did this, but we do know that they knew that they could, and we know that they considered it. European diseases also did not strike the Americas in one apocalyptic uber outbreak. That's a common misconception. They came and went in waves, each starting in and impacting different places. Some did spread over large areas, but many stayed localized. No single outbreak ever traveled across the entire hemisphere. Each wave brought a different disease, lasted only a few years or even months, was separated from other waves by years or sometimes decades, and on average had only a 20 to 50% casualty rate. While that is still incredibly high, it's not 90% at one time. And it's not too high for communities to recover from. Disease survivors built immunity that gave them higher survival rates in subsequent outbreaks. There were plenty of instances where communities had enough time to recover between outbreaks that their populations were actually returning to pre-contact levels. What kept these diseases coming back, and what ultimately led to the severity of the demographic collapse, was not just a virgin soil environment, but the conditions imposed by the continual encroachment of colonialism into native land. Slavery, famine, war, genocide, the breakdown of social structures, institutions, and trade routes, etc. All of these things create the conditions for disease and lead to outbreaks, both in the Americas and in Eurasia, where there is no virgin soil effect to blame it on. The inhumane conditions brought by colonial policies resulted in more disease outbreaks and made those outbreaks more damaging and more difficult to recover from. The 90+% mortality rate among Indigenous Americans from European diseases was not an inevitability, and it was not unavoidable. It was a preventable outcome exacerbated by intentional decisions. The story of European interaction with North America is not just a story of disease, death, and destruction, however. It's also a story of ethnic mixture and intercultural exchange. For much of the 400 years that it took for Euro-Americans to gain control over the whole continent, it was indigenous political and cultural power that held sway across most of the land. Euro-Americans may have claimed the whole continent and may have tried to exert coercive control over indigenous peoples, but lines on maps do not control on the ground make. For most of those 400 years, European hegemony was confined to pockets of intense settlement, outside of which native power was still in control. Thus, Euro-Americans were forced to recognize indigenous sovereignty, deal with native peoples as equals, or even superiors, and had to adapt to indigenous ways of doing things. They had to make treaties with independent indigenous governments. They had to learn native languages, had to respect native diplomacy, conduct business using native currencies. Many took native husbands or wives and fathered mixed children, etc. Many times and in many places, middle grounds popped up, places that were defined by mixed societies. The quintessential middle ground emerged around the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, areas that were claimed by New France during the 17th and 18th centuries. The first permanent French settlements in North America were established at the beginning of the 17th century along the St. Lawrence River, at Tadoussac in 1600 and Quebec City in 1608, and the French presence quickly extended deep into the continent. This is because France wasn't that interested in taking native land and never sent over a lot of colonists like Britain did. Instead, the economic lifeline of their colonies in New France and later Louisiana was the fur trade, conducted primarily by indigenous trappers. The relationship, therefore, was dictated largely on indigenous terms. French fur traders became fluent in several indigenous languages. It was usually the French learning native languages, not natives learning French. More French men emigrated to North America than French women, so French men often married and raised families with indigenous women. This happened so much that a new mixed ethnic group emerged, mostly in central Canada, but also in the Great Lakes and northern plains and Rockies of the US. This is the Métis. Indigenous diplomatic practices centered on reciprocal gift-giving as a sign of respect and a relationship-building tool. French traders and the French government were thus forced to spend exuberant amounts of money on gifts to maintain relations with their native business partners and allies. Whenever the French tried to get stingy with their gifts, natives wouldn't bring them pelts or fight in their wars. In fact, when the 7 Years' War broke out with Britain in 1754, native allies were critical to the French war effort in America, hence why this theater of the war is known as the French and Indian War. As the war dragged on and got more expensive, France got tighter-fisted with their gifts, so native tribes started walking away, crippling the French war effort and contributing to their defeat in the North American theater. In fact, a lot of the conflict between natives and non-natives in these eastern woodlands from the 17th through 19th centuries centered around non-natives not wanting to respect the middle ground anymore, and natives trying to re-establish it. English colonialism focused much more on importing English settlers, and English towns strongly preferred to be segregated. Later US colonialism would follow this same model. Even in these segregationist English-speaking areas, however, under the right conditions, middle grounds still popped up and thrived for a time. One example is the city of Seattle in the Pacific Northwest. It was founded in 1851 as a white settlement, but for its first 30 years functioned as a mixed society, where natives outnumbered non-natives and non-natives usually learned to speak a native language. There is a very real alternative history where a white ethnic supermajority was never established in the United States, where instead the United States always existed as a mixed nation. The path of violent, genocidal, segregationist domination over native peoples that the English colonies and the United States pursued was a choice, not a manifest historical destiny. These middle grounds of intercultural transmission had many benefits for both sides. Europeans stood to make handsome profits from trade with indigenous nations, and the many new crops they were introduced to, like tomatoes, bell peppers, corn, potatoes, and many others, would have profound impacts back in Europe. Indigenous nations eagerly bought European trade goods, like metal pots, pans, and utensils, metal farm tools, knives, clothing and blankets, etc., as it was much more convenient and less labor-intensive to buy these goods from Europeans rather than make them themselves. In fact, many native governments initially welcomed small-scale white settlement in their lands precisely because they wanted access to these European trade goods. Trouble started only when European demands turned to native land. There were two trade commodities that native nations prized above all others: horses and firearms, both of which would bring profound changes in their wakes. Horses first evolved in North America about 55 million years ago before spreading to the rest of the world. However, for reasons that still aren't entirely understood, they went extinct in the Western Hemisphere at the end of the Pleistocene about 10,000 years ago. They wouldn't be seen on these continents again until the Spanish reintroduced them in the early 1500s. The first Spanish colonists to arrive in the Southwest, what was then the North to New Spain, reached the upper Rio Grande Valley in 1598, led by the conquistador Juan de Oñate. That same year, the area was organized as the colony of New Mexico, and in 1610 the city of Santa Fe was founded. For the next 150 years or so, New Mexico would be the only area in the Southwest with any appreciable Spanish presence. No serious attempts at colonizing California were made until the late 1760s, and the first permanent Spanish settlement in Texas, San Antonio, wasn't founded until 1731. The Spanish brought their horses to Santa Fe and traded with local indigenous nations who quickly saw their incredible potential. However, for the first few decades, horses spread across North America very slowly because the Spanish maintained a tight control over the horse trade by castrating all the males. Native peoples could get their hands on horses, but they couldn't breed them. This changed in 1680. Spanish rule in New Mexico was very abusive towards the native Pueblos. They suppressed Pueblo religion, attempted forced conversion to Catholicism, and demanded stiff tax and work quotas. Eventually, the abuse got too much and the Pueblos fought back. In 1680, organized by the Treuer religious leader Pekka, the Pueblo revolt drove the Spanish out of New Mexico entirely for the next 12 years. The Spanish returned to New Mexico in 1692 and were repelled again. They could only successfully re-establish control over the territory after Diego de Vargas, one by one, assaulted and destroyed all but one Pueblo town. Even after this, though, the Spaniards had learned the lesson of 1680 and thus ruled with a looser fist than before. The revolt happened so quickly that the Spanish didn't have time to evacuate all their belongings. They left behind the horses, including uncastrated males. The horses escaped, and a wild breeding population was once again established in North America, which now spread very quickly. Just as how the spread of maize transformed societies in its wake, the return of the horse revolutionized life for dozens of native nations all over the continent, in particular on the Great Plains. The grass oceans of the open plain were now no longer untraversable barriers. This meant that bison herds could now be followed much closer, hunted much easier, and in much greater numbers. It was now possible to live on the plains independent of river-bound agriculture. This new reality attracted many native nations from other parts of the continent to move in and make their new homes on the plains. Tribes like the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Blackfeet, Crow, Eastern Shoshone, Lakota, and Comanche. All these new plains nations became horse tribes, master riders whose cultures now revolved around horses and bison. It is hard to overstate just how drastic, fast, and complete of a transformation this was. Some of these tribes changed from being sedentary agriculturalists living east of the Mississippi and eating things like maize and squash with ceremonial cycles that centered around planting and harvesting seasons, to plains-dwelling, bison-eating hunter-gatherers with horse-based economies, social hierarchies tied to the amount of horses a person owned, who could ride hanging off the side of a horse at full gallop and still shoot a bow and arrow, and made that whole transition within a century. The amount of social change that horses brought to the plains is, I would go so far as to say, unparalleled in all of human history. Of the many tribes who enacted this transition, by the 1770s, two had emerged as the political and cultural powerhouses of the plains: the Comanche in the southern plains and the Lakota in the northern plains. European contact also saw the introduction of firearms to North America. Access to firearms gave native nations a leg up in conflict with traditional rivals. They were also obviously effective against European colonists. Thus, they were a hot trade commodity, but they were also very expensive. Throughout most of the continent, the high price tag of firearms, combined with far distances from the nearest European trading outpost, meant few people could get their hands on them. However, in the East, access to firearms was much easier, resulting in an arms race between native nations. As a result, the intensity of fur trapping increased dramatically as nations attempted to procure enough pelts to afford firearms. Traditional practices of sustainable harvesting that prevented depletion of any given resource broke down, eventually leading to the extinction of beavers throughout much of their natural range in the eastern US. In the same way that the increasing industrialization of militaries in Europe during the Renaissance led to an increase in the violence and destruction of European warfare, so too did the proliferation of firearms amongst native nations have a similarly destructive impact. Long-running traditional conflicts between neighbors turned into bitter wars of expansion as each side vied for more land on which to harvest more pelts so they could buy more guns. This led to a vicious cycle of environmental destruction and international conflict known as the Beaver Wars that were fought on and off over the course of the 17th century, mainly in the Northeast, Great Lakes, and Ohio and St. Lawrence valleys. All of these areas I just mentioned, especially the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, sat on the borderlands between New France, New England, and for a couple decades there, New Netherland. This added another layer to the intensity of the conflict, as it wasn't just native nations competing for access to firearms. France, England, and the Netherlands were also competing with each other for access to native allies. One country would emerge as the uncontested victor of this era of conflict: the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the League of the Five Nations, later Six Nations, or what many of you may know as the Iroquois Confederacy. After suffering intensely from disease outbreaks in the early 17th century, they had gone on the offensive to rebuild their strength, extending their influence far beyond their homelands in upstate New York. They subjugated their neighbors into either alliance or vassalage, creating an empire that at its height in 1700 stretched from Lake Champlain all the way to the Mississippi and Lake Michigan, controlling the entire Ohio Valley and eastern and central Great Lakes. Their sphere of influence extended even further than this, encompassing practically the entire Northeast and St. Lawrence Valley. The Haudenosaunee were so powerful that they dictated terms of trade and foreign policy to the European colonists up until the late 18th century. They kept the British boxed in east of the Appalachians, even though the British wanted to move west, and they told the French and Dutch what tribes they could and could not trade with, even though these two wanted to trade with everybody. Whenever Europeans tried to go behind their backs and trade with Haudenosaunee rivals, the Haudenosaunee would attack and force them to stop. They made colonizing very difficult and very expensive for the Europeans. Leveraging their central position, they played the interests of New France, New England, and New Netherland off of one another. They were the European kingmakers in eastern North America. They generally sided with the English in conflicts between the colonies because the French kept allying and doing business with Haudenosaunee rivals, but they could side with the Dutch or French or stay out of a conflict entirely if it suited them. In fact, the instability that the Haudenosaunee caused throughout the Northeast was a large part of the reason that New Netherland failed to get off the ground as a colony. For nigh on 2 centuries, everybody in the Northeast, native and non-native, lived under the shadow and influence of Haudenosaunee power. It was only when their confederacy split during the American Revolution that this power came to an end. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's turn our eyes to the English colonies. England established their first permanent settlement at Jamestown in 1607 and another at Plymouth in 1620. Both of these colonies had very rocky relations with local native nations despite being heavily dependent on native support to get off the ground. As I mentioned earlier, English colonists were much less comfortable intermingling with native people than French or Spanish colonists were. This is because the English, from their very first days on the continent, practiced what is known as settler colonialism. What most people think of when they hear the term colonialism is extractive colonialism. This is where a foreign empire conquers a sovereign nation, sets themselves up as local rulers, then proceeds to harvest the colony's resources and export them to the imperial center. The demographics of the colony do not significantly change as few people relocate from the imperial heartland to the colony. The goal is the colony's resources much more than the colony's land. This was the form taken with Spanish and French colonization in North America. The Spanish colonial model focused on establishing Spanish rule over an indigenous population by toppling indigenous rulers and replacing them with Spanish officials. But the population remained overwhelmingly indigenous. The French model focused on establishing alliances with native nations so that they would allow French trade outposts on their lands and trap and fight for their French allies. Both the French and Spanish models saw relatively small numbers of Europeans emigrating to the colonies, and both resulted in a lot of intermarriage between natives and non-natives, leading to the emergence of mixed ethnicities, the Métis in New France and Mestizos in New Spain. Both of these can be described as inclusive colonialism because there wasn't a hard boundary between native land and non-native land. Don't be confused by the word inclusive, though. This was still colonialism. It was still violent and brutal and still resulted in a lot of native suffering and death, especially in New Spain. In settler colonialism, however, the goal is the land itself. Thus, an imperial power will depopulate a colony of its indigenous residents, either through deportation, assimilation, or genocide, and then repopulate the territory with colonists from the imperial core. This leads to significant demographic changes in the colony, creating either a sizable minority of colonial settlers, as is the case with South Africa, or a near complete replacement, as in the English North American colonies and the later USA. From the very beginning, England practiced this settler colonialism. Large numbers of English colonists migrated to North America, where they established segregated whites-only towns and recreated in North America the English society they left at home. There wasn't just money to be made in selling North America's resources, but also in selling North America's land. Land speculation was a significantly bigger business in English America than it was in New France or New Spain. English settler colonialism was also a model of exclusive colonialism. There was always the concept of a frontier, a line ever moving west, on one side of which the land was filled with whites and only whites living in a perfect recreation of civilized Europe, and on the other side of which the land was an untamed wilderness filled with native savages. French and Spanish colonialism didn't have this same concept of the frontier. For them, the frontier was the border between their colonial claims and another European empire's colonial claims. It was not the border between native and non-native land, because New France and New Spain weren't that segregated. New Spain definitely had a racial caste system, but not the same kind of apartheid system. When the English colonies eventually became the United States, the new country continued the same English tradition of exclusive settler colonialism and the land speculation that came with it. In fact, for a good portion of early US history, the federal government's primary source of income was revenue from the sale of stolen native land. Under the US regime, the frontier kept pushing so far into native land that the US couldn't continue to just push natives out. They had to come up with the reservation system. Reservations, thus, are pockets of native land that were allowed to exist on the white side of the frontier border, but only because originally natives were supposed to be confined to their reservations. With this concept of settler colonialism in mind, we can see that the United States, as well as basically every other modern nation-state in this hemisphere, is clearly a colonial empire. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the discussion of middle grounds, total segregation may have been the English goal, but the reality was rarely so clean. Both Jamestown and Plymouth got off to very bumpy starts due to poor management that led to disease, starvation, conflict with their indigenous neighbors, and over 50% mortality rates. The situation was so bad and supporting these floundering colonies so expensive that there were fierce debates in the English Parliament about whether or not to pull the plug and give up on colonizing North America. Both of these colonies were only able to survive their first few years after allying with a local native authority who then provided them food. However, this fact did little to change the Anglos' attitudes, and they quickly began expanding into native land, exacting more pressure and abuse upon their indigenous neighbors. This led to bloody wars of retaliation. In 1622, Opechancanough, paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, on whose lands Jamestown stood, attacked, killing 300 colonists, a third of Jamestown's population. This was the start of the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. He attacked again in 1644, the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, and succeeded in killing 500 colonists, but this time that was only 6% of the colony's population. In 1675 and 76 in New England, the Wampanoag sachem Metacom attacked the Puritans there, killing 5% of the Puritan population and destroying over a third of English towns. This was Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War. However, in each conflict, the English colonists exacted genocidal retribution. During the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, the English launched a campaign of burning Powhatan fields and crop stores just before winter, creating famine and destabilizing the Powhatan state. In the aftermath of Metacom's War, 25% of all New England natives, whether or not they'd fought against the English, were either slaughtered or sold into slavery. Government-paid bounties for native scalps became common practice throughout the English colonies. It was through coercive land theft backed with the threat of this sort of violence that the English established control over the Atlantic coast. Even so, that control was still limited to areas of intense settlement, but the frontier remained a very indigenous landscape, where colonial ambitions were tempered by indigenous politics. Trying to conquer this native continent proved so difficult and so expensive that the British Crown decided it just wasn't worth the trouble. They established the Proclamation Line of 1763, forbidding all white settlement west of the Appalachians. This royally pissed off their land-hungry colonists, was largely ignored, and was even cited as one of the intolerable acts which led to the American Revolution. Most native nations in the 7 Years' War had sided with the French due to the British colonists' insatiable lust for their land. For this exact same reason, most nations now sided with the British Crown in the war against the American colonists, choices that the new nation would not soon forget. Here is a good time to survey the state of colonization in North America. In 1521, Juan Ponce de Leon attempted to set up the first European colony in North America north of Mexico. The attempt was in southwest Florida. The establishment of the United States came a little over 250 years later. In those 250 years of colonization, what did Europeans have to show for their efforts? Between Britain, France, Spain, the United States, and Russia, almost all the land in North America, save for far northwestern Canada and northern Alaska, was claimed by some Euro-American empire. However, there were only 4 areas across all that land with any appreciable European populations: the upper Rio Grande Valley, the lowest reaches of the Mississippi, the St. Lawrence Valley, and the Atlantic coast inland to the Appalachians. Outside of those zones, there was only one town with a couple hundred Russians on the southern coast of Alaska. California had just barely begun to be colonized by Spanish missionaries in 1769. Southeast Texas had only a handful of Spanish towns, and small British and French trading outposts dotted the rest of the Mississippi and the Canadian interior. Despite the lines they drew on maps, European empires had a very hard time extending authority beyond major colonial population centers. The new United States would seek to change this, and quickly work to expand its empire over native land. The invasions of the Trans-Appalachian West dominated U.S. foreign policy from the 1780s through the 1830s, but once again, it was a very difficult and expensive struggle. Even though the American colonists and their new government wanted to get their hands on as much native land as possible, the new government had to contend with the fact that it was broke, weak, and surrounded by colonial neighbors who wanted nothing more than its failure and were willing to work with native nations to help with the process. The American public itself was also divided on how to approach Indian policy. On one side, there were frontier Indian hunters, aggressive militiamen who advocated deportation or extermination. On the opposite end, there were the missionaries who believed natives should be converted to Christianity and made to assimilate into American culture, and yet others who were in the middle. Just letting indigenous nations be indigenous nations on their own terms wasn't an option. The federal government kept vacillating between the assimilationists and the deportationists, resulting in a carrot-and-stick approach to Indian policy. Violent conquest was the primary means of colonizing the Ohio River Valley through the 1790s. Regular army units were frequently employed against native nations in the region, but because of the expense, the government relied heavily on irregular forces, primarily volunteer settler militias, to accomplish much of the fighting. Their style of warfare was extremely violent and indiscriminate. Roving bands of self-styled Indian hunters would attack and completely destroy any native towns they could find. Crops and food stores were specifically targeted, and no discrimination was made between killing warriors or women, children, and elders. Many with experience in these irregular militias would go on to join the regular army, carrying with them this same culture of indiscriminate counterinsurgency warfare and defining the US way of war throughout the 19th century. We're going to discuss certain high-profile massacres of native communities later in the video, but just keep in mind that those weren't exceptions. They were the rule. Even with the use of irregular forces, colonization by war was still costly and overly demanding, so this was balanced with a simultaneous program of diplomacy. The new constitution recognized the sovereignty of native nations separate from the US, and the new US government engaged in treaties with tribes just the same as the British Crown had. In fact, in the Northwest Ordinance of 1789, similar to what the Crown had done in 1763, Congress forbade taking or settling any native land without federal approval in the Old Northwest, what we call today the Midwest. Even so, Uncle Sam's peace policies did little to stem colonizer violence on indigenous land. The settler population just took matters into their own hands. Indian hunting militias terrorized the nations of the Southeast just the same as the Ohio Country. The federal government would tacitly discourage their activities, but then proceed to reward many of the militia leaders for their actions and also utilize the militia violence as a bargaining tool in treaty negotiations. The US had fostered such a culture of settler violence that the federal government didn't need to do all the work. All this inconsistency changed in 1828. The election of the populist and raging Indian hater Andrew Jackson as president settled the debate in favor of deportation, or as they called it, Indian removal. This would be the US's final solution to its Indian problem for the next 60 years. That's not to say there wasn't still opposition to this policy. Jackson's hardline stances faced harsh criticism from opposing political parties. Yes, I said opposing parties plural. The US's notorious two-party system hadn't quite fully materialized yet. The centerpiece legislation of Jacksonian Indian policy, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, passed on a near party line vote. It got only 3 votes in favor from other parties, and a sizable chunk of Jackson's own party defected and voted against it. It passed the House of Representatives by 4 votes. Nevertheless, it did pass, and resulted in almost all native nations east of the Mississippi being forcibly rounded up and deported to lands west of the Mississippi, thousands dying along the way. This was the infamous Trail of Tears, but the deportations affected more than just the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. Every tribe on the wrong side of the river was targeted, resulting in deportations from the Midwest and New England as well. Several native communities were successfully able to lay low and hide from the law's enforcement, so some small pockets of eastern native nations still remain in their homelands today. It's worth taking a second to talk about the 5 civilized tribes. They are called this because when American missionaries and the US government told them that they'd be left alone and able to keep their lands if they just assimilated and became civilized Americans, that's exactly what they did. They organized into democratic nation-states with written constitutions based on the US's own 3-branch government model. They now had presidents and congresses and supreme courts. They adopted American clothing and gender roles, began living in American-style housing, and many converted to Christianity. They developed writing systems for their languages, taught their people literacy, and began publishing written books, newspapers, and Bible translations. They adopted the social hierarchy of Americans, which was more rigid and unequal than their own traditional social structures. Many in the new upper class even bought black slaves and began engaging in the South's plantation economy. They did all of this, and they still got deported. Because the issue was never their culture. It was always simply their race and their land. The deported nations were promised land at their destinations that would be reserved for them in perpetuity, never again to be altered. This, however, was another lie, and reservation boundaries were redrawn at will whenever they became inconvenient for new colonizers. As Americans kept pushing west, new reservations were established and new deportations enforced throughout Western territories. More and more native land was taken through lies, the point of a gun, or outright theft. The policies of deportation and reservation confinement had certain procedural hurdles they had to jump through to be considered legal. This was because of the Marshall Trilogy. The Marshall Trilogy was a series of Supreme Court cases in the 1820s and 30s that laid the legal bedrock for the U.S. Indigenous relationship that continues to this day. Resting its logic on the legal precedents of the doctrine of discovery, the court defined tribes as, quote, domestic dependent nations. finding indigenous nations to be unique political entities but still under the authority of the federal government. They possess a modicum of sovereignty and self-determination independent of state governments, but not completely on the same level as a foreign government either. It's important to remember that this is not an objective definition of what Native nations are or can be, just a finding of how the US federal government sees Native nations. The federal government wanted to exert its authority over indigenous peoples, but respecting them as full human beings living in fully fledged independent nations interferes with that agenda, so the court found a way around that. The Marshall Trilogy does give important recognition to tribal sovereignty, but it limits that sovereignty just as much as it supports it. So long as the government follows certain processes, it still has wide leeway to abuse Native people and steal their land. Still today in 2024, if the government really wanted to, it could cease recognition of all indigenous treaties and tribal governments and seize every acre of Native land. The 1840s saw the United States expand into the Southwest, so now would be a good time to backtrack and see how things had developed in Spanish lands. Since the Spanish returned to the area after the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, the settler population in their northern frontier had risen and expanded into new areas, but only very slowly. Between 1769 and 1833, 21 Catholic missions were established along the central and southern coast of California. These were outposts of colonial settlement meant to serve as the foundations of frontier towns and places where the Spanish hoped to Christianize and civilize local indigenous peoples. Now, missions had been a feature of Spanish colonialism from the very beginning, appearing in Florida in 1549 and New Mexico in 1610, and all the missions were abusive towards their native inhabitants. In the Pueblo Revolt, the Pueblos specifically targeted clergy, killing as many as 40% of the clergy in New Mexico because of their treatment in the missions. Even so, the California missions were particularly heinous. Every mission was assigned an army detachment that would raid local native communities and force them into the missions, where they were worked to death in slave labor conditions. Disobedient natives could expect to be beaten until unconscious. Disease death was also rampant, made worse by mission policies such as locking natives in their cramped dorms outside of work hours. Rape and sexual violence were endemic. These places were church-run concentration camps that killed around 70,000 people. There were a few differences that made California's missions so much worse than those in Florida or New Mexico. In Florida, the Spanish never had a strong enough military presence to force people into the missions, so Florida natives could just leave at will. Spanish colonialism as a whole in Florida didn't have much lasting impact on its indigenous peoples. In New Mexico, there was a stronger military presence, but the revolt of 1680 proved that it could be overwhelmed by organized resistance of the urban pueblos. Pueblo resistance continued to flare up over the decades whenever the Spanish hand got too heavy, so they were able to temper the worst impulses of colonialism. In California, however, there was a strong Spanish military and settler presence, and California natives didn't have concentrated enough populations to resist it. Thus, they were forced into the missions, from which escape wasn't much of an option. Indigenous Californians hadn't developed agriculture, but they had practiced the horticulture and controlled burning we talked about earlier. Spanish settlers introduced livestock and allowed them to graze freely, thus destroying native food sources. Then there was the presence of slave raiders and the army rangers roaming the countryside. All of this together meant that leaving the missions most likely meant starvation, recapture, or slavery. Consequently, only between 5 and 7% of mission Indians successfully escaped. Even under these conditions, natives still resisted their abuse. The Chumash in what is today Santa Barbara County organized a revolt in 1824 and succeeded in taking over or escaping 3 missions. But the revolt was put down and most of the Chumash recaptured within a few months. The mission period came to an end in 1833 when they were secularized by the Mexican government, the church lands expropriated, and mission Indians allowed to go free. Now, I need to acknowledge the legacy that the Black legend has left on this era of historical research. Yes, British and American writers have led a centuries-long propaganda campaign to exaggerate Spanish colonial atrocities and whitewash their own. But that doesn't mean there were no Spanish atrocities. We have plenty of Indigenous and Spanish sources attesting to the level of abuse and exploitation in these missions and in Spanish colonialism in general. But again, British, French, and American colonists were all just as abusive when they had the opportunity. European colonialism was all cut from the same cloth. Outside of Southern California and the Upper Rio Grande, the Spanish and later Mexicans never had a strong hold of their northern frontier. For one, they didn't really care about the area that much. It didn't have many resources that they knew of to extract, so its primary role was to act as a buffer zone between the silver mines of Zacatecas and whoever held Louisiana. Even more consequentially, though, the northern frontier was subject to frequent raids by nomadic tribes such as the Apache, Ute, and Comanche, making the area a colonial backwater that few Spaniards wanted to move to. The Comanche were an especially big headache. Once they'd established control over the southern plains of West Texas by the 1770s, not only did they raid Spanish settlements in East Texas, but they turned south, crossing the Rio Grande and raiding deep into Mexico. By the 1840s, they were raiding as far south as Guadalajara and Querétaro. This Mexico City could not tolerate, so they invited Americans to settle in Texas. We all learn about this in American high school, but what we don't usually learn is that the American settlers were meant as cannon fodder for the Comanche. When the Americans appealed to Mexico City for protection, they didn't get any. After all, the point of their presence was not for Mexico to protect Americans from the Comanche, but for Americans to protect Mexico from the Comanche. Understandably, the Americans weren't too happy about this, so they rebelled and took Texas. Even after the U.S. annexed Texas in 1845, the Comanche continued to keep Americans off the plains and destabilized Texas for another 30 years. The last corner of the continent to come into contact with Europeans was the Pacific Northwest. Russian expeditions explored the Alaskan coastline in the 1740s, and fur traders followed shortly thereafter. Very few Russian settlers ever moved to Alaska, so the fur trade relied heavily on indigenous labor. But the Russians ruled with a heavy hand that led to frequent conflict. They would kidnap the wives or children of Onongan and Alutiiq men and hold them for a ransom of furs. Similar tactics led to war with the Tlingit that got one Russian settlement sacked and burned to the ground. These poor native relations kept Russian America a very unprofitable colony. The peak of the maritime fur trade ran from about the 1790s through the 1840s, with Russians trading in Alaska and the British and Americans in the Oregon Country. Just as with the continental fur trade further east, the maritime trade hunted Pacific sea otters to near extinction and increased conflict between Northwest Native nations through the proliferation of firearms, though things didn't reach near as dramatic a level as the Beaver Wars of the Northeast. The fur trade didn't just bring destruction, though. It also spawned a golden age of Northwest Native art, literature, and social culture. With the trade's close in the 1840s, the US and Britain resolved their territorial disputes over the Oregon Country, and the influx of American colonists began. The 1840s was a dramatic decade for the United States. It saw the country almost double in size, with its territory, as recognized by European nations, now stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In reality, this new territory was all still indigenous land, but the following decades would see white Americans surging west to colonize it, and doing so with genocidal violence. Numerous massacres of entire indigenous communities feature prominently in this period of history. Sand Creek, Colorado, 1864, 230 murdered. Marias River, Montana, 1870, 200 murdered. Camp Grant, Arizona, 1871, 144 murdered. Wounded Knee, North Dakota, 1890, 300 murdered. And many, many more. California, again, was an especially violent bloodbath due to the incredible influx of profit-hungry colonizers in the gold rush. The state's first American governor proclaimed before the legislature in 1851, quote, "A war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct." Under the onslaught, indigenous nations fought back and fought hard. On the plains, the Lakota and Comanche won repeated military victories against the U.S. Army and settler militias. They kept colonizers out of their lands and blunted the invasion of the plains for decades. Faced with this level of military resistance, the U.S. government adopted a policy of biological warfare, starving indigenous people into submission. At the time, there was plenty of money to be made from hunting bison, the primary source of food for plains tribes. The hides could be tanned into leather for factory belts, and the bones were ground into fertilizer, among other uses. There was actually a rich bison fur trade with plains nations that made the Comanche and Lakota very wealthy. Even this wasn't enough to satisfy the demand of Eastern companies, though, so they would commonly hire bands of professional bison hunters to slaughter as many as they could find. The federal government seized on this trend and directed it towards the aim of conquering the plains nations. The army would frequently outfit bison hunting parties and even guide them to specific hunting grounds where they could do the most damage to plains nations. That's not to mention the many times that army units themselves went on hunting expeditions purely to reduce bison numbers. The combined public and private war on the bison decimated their population, from 30 to 60 million before 1820 to less than 1,000 by the 1890s. This had the desired effect of causing famine throughout plains nations and eliminating their military strength. The plains were not conquered militarily. They were conquered by tactics that today would be considered war crimes. Eventually, many in American society started feeling guilty about all the violence and pushed for reform. The assimilationists, who had been shut out of Indian policies since Jackson, now took back the driver's seat from the deportationists. These reformers were often associated with the broader progressive movement, a largely church-led movement that aimed to take on many of the country's worst social ills and which saw government action as a crucial component of the cause. Thus, in 1887, the General Allotment Act, also called the Dawes Act, was passed, ushering in the next phase of federal Indian policy, allotment and assimilation. This act again broke treaty promises by carving up reservation land and allotting plots to native residents, a 32-acre plot per single man and a 64-acre plot per married couple. Sorry, ladies, you get nothing on your own. All land remaining after allotment to tribal members was open to white settlement. This is why today many reservations are a checkerboard of land ownership and jurisdiction, often with the majority of a reservation's land being held in non-native hands. In the 47 years the Dawes Act was in effect, 90 million acres of treaty-protected land passed out of native hands. That is 2/3 of all the land held by native peoples in 1887. Allotment and assimilation was sold as a more humanitarian way to deal with the Indian problem. Rather than savagely slaughtering people, they would integrate natives into American society. It's telling, though, that allowing native nations to operate as their own sovereign entities and choose their futures as they saw fit was not an option that was on the table. These humanitarian reformers still held deeply racist and colonialist views, not that much better than their more bloodthirsty countrymen. They thought that unique indigenous cultures and identities had no further place in white society, and their policies were little more than a new iteration of the same old goal. That of depriving indigenous peoples of their lands so specifically white people could have access to them. They just went about it in a more sanitized way. Along with the policy of cracking reservations, assimilation's flagship policy, and one of America's darkest moments, began in 1879, Indian boarding schools. Land allotment was seen as the best way to assimilate reluctant adults, but in order to accomplish the full destruction of indigenous identities, reformers targeted the children, sending them to schools specifically designed to teach them how to be white. Indigenous children from the ages of 5 through 18, though sometimes even older, were separated from their families, legally required to attend off-reservation boarding schools for 9 to 12 months out of the year. Fearing that any exposure to their cultures and communities would hinder the progress of assimilation, the schools heavily restricted contact with their families. School administrators often intercepted and hid the children's mail without telling them, leaving these kids to go for years wondering why their families had stopped talking to them. Their hair was cut, they were made to wear American-style clothes, and they were given English names and forced to speak English lest they be beaten for speaking their native languages. Girls were taught household chores and boys manual labor trades, though many of the trades they were prepared for were already outdated and replaced by machines by the time the schools started. Their education really only readied them for lives in servant roles. The guiding principle of these schools was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man. And it was under that banner that indigenous kids were subject to truly horrific abuse. Beatings were habitual, the food was substandard, and children were often starved as discipline. Every day they were told that their cultures, families, and ways of life were satanic, and that they were bound to burn in hell for all eternity if they did not whiten up. The over 500 of these institutions that existed were funded by the federal government, but primarily run by church organizations, the staff dishing out this abuse being mostly clergy. Thousands of indigenous children who attended boarding schools were sexually assaulted, often repeatedly. It's estimated that thousands more died from these conditions, and it was only in 2022 that the US government began making any effort to understand the full scale of those deaths. This wasn't just a uniquely American problem either. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand all had similar sorts of boarding schools, all with similarly horrific results. Indigenous parents were required to send their children to these schools. Those who resisted could see their food rations withheld until they starved into submission. Often, though, if resistance was widespread enough in a community, the army would just swoop in and kidnap any children they could find. These schools operated with conditions hardly improving for several generations. Things finally began changing in the 1970s with the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, which gave Native parents the right for the first time to choose what schools to send their children to, and the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which allowed tribal governments to take over the management of education on reservations. Some of these former Indian boarding schools are still in operation today, though they've been under new management since at least the 90s. The impacts of these schools cannot be overstated. Every major social problem besetting Native communities today can be traced to the trauma inflicted by these schools. High rates of mental health issues, drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, crime, suicide, low academic achievement, etc. They are all the legacies of a long and sordid history of genocide, but most directly the impacts of Indian boarding schools. The allotment and boarding school policies devastated Indigenous communities, and by the early 1930s the government was forced to confront this fact. For the first time, supporting tribal sovereignty rather than destroying it became federal policy. The flagship legislation was the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which sought to restore to tribes a modicum of control over their lands by allowing the establishment of tribal governments that would be recognized as legally functioning governments by the United States. Tribes have been governed very differently prior to the IRA. Many tribes had preserved their traditional governing structures to the best of their ability, but the US didn't recognize them as having any legal authority, so in practice they operated more like community organizing platforms. Instead, all authority on a reservation was vested in a single representative of the US government, the Indian agent. They were responsible for all matters of exerting American authority over Native people, including the reservation's financials. Needless to say, this was probably the single most corrupt position in the entire American civil apparatus. Many treaties mandated that the US government pay a given tribe for the land that they'd surrendered. Seems only fair. However, this often took the form of material goods rather than solid cash. Indian agents skimmed millions of dollars of this money and either gave the tribe under their care the cheapest goods they could find, or none at all. There is a very good reason that Hedley Lamar's long list of crooks and vagabonds in blazing saddles includes Indian agents. Because of the rampant corruption, the position of Indian agent was eventually phased out under Teddy Roosevelt's administration in favor of hiring school superintendents as reservation overseers. However, the basic principle of vesting all authority over a reservation in a white American's hands remained. The IRA of 1934 changed this by providing tribes the opportunity to organize their own government that would be legally recognized and thus dealt with directly by the federal government, disposing of the white superintendents or Indian agents. However, these governments couldn't adopt whatever structure they wanted. The law had a long list of requirements for how an IRA government would operate, so a vast majority of traditional governing structures wouldn't be recognized. Consequently, only about 2/3 of tribes chose to establish IRA-style governments. Probably the most beneficial aspect of the IRA was that it ended allotment on reservations. It had no mechanism for returning any of the land stolen through the policy, but at least it would stem the bleeding. Boarding schools, however, continued largely unchanged. The pendulum swung back the other way after World War II. Post-war America, with its conservatism, conformity, and intense white supremacy, didn't have much tolerance for the continued existence of unique indigenous cultures and political entities. Once again, most white Americans believed that indigenous Americans should whiten up and assimilate into oblivion. This attitude birthed the policies of termination and relocation. Little more than updated versions of allotment and assimilation. Termination began in 1953. It was Uncle Sam's effort to wash his hands of the pesky Indian business once and for all by terminating the government-to-government relationship with tribes. If a tribe was terminated, that meant it no longer had federal recognition as a distinct sovereign political entity. Its reservation lands would be broken up and again sold to the highest bidder. Any treaty obligations would be disregarded, but what's more, all the tribal members would now no longer be part of a federally recognized Indian tribe. Thus, as far as the US government was concerned, they would no longer be Indians, and no longer eligible for any Indian-related services or exercise of treaty rights. The goal, of course, was just to crack at the last protections keeping white hands from the few remaining native lands, but just as with the allotment era, it was sold as a humanitarian gift to uplift the poor and destitute indigenous people into middle-class American prosperity. This did not happen. 109 tribes were terminated during this time period, and in each and every case, their citizens were worse off after termination than they'd been before. Once again, their communities were cracked up and forced apart, now without any sort of political voice to keep themselves together. Just as with the allotment era, thousands of indigenous people became homeless due to the actions of white land speculators. And because you can't stop at just breaking up reservations, the assimilationist side of the new policy began in 1956, relocation. The relocation program sought to dismantle any semblance of community Native peoples had by moving them from reservations into cities, where they would be surrounded by and swept into mainstream Anglo-American society. The program promised a free bus ticket to a city of your choosing, where the government would help you find housing and a job, provide job training, and pay your rent until you were on your feet enough to support yourself. Say it with me now. This, of course, was bullshit. The job training programs were so underfunded they practically didn't exist, and that rent support pretty much ceased after the first month. Natives were basically dropped in cities that they did not know and left to their own devices. Once again, many became homeless as a result. In the decade that relocation was in effect, about 200,000 indigenous people moved into cities, thus creating the urban Indian population that has only grown since. Today in 2024, about 70% of America's indigenous population lives in or near urban areas. The termination era also saw some more of the darkest actions the United States has taken against Native peoples, namely the abduction of indigenous children and the involuntary sterilization of indigenous women. Lots of new funding from the federal government and a growing interest in protecting child welfare resulted in a dramatic expansion of state child welfare agencies beginning in the 50s. When it came to indigenous families, these agencies were particularly aggressive. Indigenous children were removed from their families at extremely high rates for no good reason. The numbers varied state by state, but Native kids were removed anywhere from 4 to 20 times more often than non-Native kids. They were removed under the duress and many times coercion of their caregivers, most of the time without due process or any legal counsel, and for reasons that amounted to little more than poverty and racism. One study found that in North Dakota, and I am not exaggerating with these numbers, I will link my source in the description, only 1% of Native child removals were done on the grounds of physical abuse. The other 99% of removals were for nebulous reasons like neglect or social deprivation. And these terms did not actually mean that the children were being uncared for, malnourished, mistreated, or anything like that. It is traditional child-rearing practice in Native cultures across the continent for extended family members to be heavily involved in caretaking. Social workers considered it child abandonment and grounds for removal when Native parents would leave their kids in the care of extended family members like aunties, uncles, and grandparents. Native children were being kidnapped from intact families just because their parents were either poor or raising their children differently from white parents. They would be placed in state institutions or more often fostered or adopted out to white families even when there were extended family members or other community members who were willing and able to take care of them. Their connections to their homes, their communities, their cultures and identities severed for years, if not permanently. Between 25 and 35% of all indigenous children in the United States were abducted from their families like this by the state from the 60s through the 70s. Just like with the boarding schools, many of the adoption agencies involved were affiliated with the church. In this case, it was usually Mormon or evangelical Christian agencies who looked to place Native children with Mormon or evangelical families. And it wasn't just racism fueling these removals. There was big money to be made in fostering Native kids. The following quote comes from a 1978 House investigation on Native child fostering and adoption policies. In some instances, financial considerations contribute to the crisis. For example, agencies established to place children have an incentive to find children to place. Indian community leaders charge that federally subsidized foster care programs encourage some non-Indian families to start baby farms in order to supplement their meager farm income with foster care payments and to obtain extra hands for farm work. The disparity between the ratio of Indian children in foster care versus the number of Indian children that are adopted seems to bear this out. For example, in Wyoming in 1969, Indians accounted for 70% of foster care placements, but only 8% of adoptive placements. Foster care payments usually cease when a child is adopted. Many of the social workers involved in this era of abductions have justified their actions by saying that they were just doing what was in the best interests of the children. But let's call a spade, shall we? They were racists who didn't believe natives made good parents. Fortunately, the passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, in 1978 has curbed the worst of these practices. Native children still get removed at around 4 times the national average for non-native children, but it is a significant improvement from before. The most important thing about ICWA is that it has strong provisions to prevent the removal of native kids from their indigenous communities. If a native child is removed from their family, ICWA prioritizes their extended family or other tribal members for placement. It also gives tribal courts much more jurisdiction in the whole process of CPS intervention in native families. As a result, it is now significantly harder for non-native adoptees to get their hands on indigenous children. In recent years, there have been a number of, thankfully failed, court challenges to ICWA, usually brought by non-native prospective adoptees and church-affiliated adoption organizations, alleging that the act discriminates against non-native adoptees. When people say stupid shit like this, it's worth remembering why ICWA exists. Because this country, and many of the very organizations that have supported challenges to ICWA, has a long and sordid history of state-sponsored kidnapping and trafficking of indigenous children. The assaults on indigenous families didn't just stop with stealing their children. For tens of thousands of indigenous women, the government stole their ability to have children. Involuntary sterilization of poor and minority women in general, for eugenicist reasons, had been an issue in the United States since the start of the 20th century. It is almost certain that many indigenous women were involuntarily sterilized prior to the 1960s, but the practice, and subsequent knowledge of it, increased dramatically in the 60s and 70s. Part of President Johnson's war on poverty included encouraging poor women to use contraceptives and have fewer children. For many women, however, this would go beyond mere encouragement into coercion. And although coerced sterilization was also directed at poor white women, Latina, Black, and Indigenous women were targeted at significantly higher rates because they were racially profiled. The federal government established the Indian Health Service in 1955 to provide healthcare for Native people both on reservations and in urban areas. For its first few decades, almost all of the staff and doctors were white. When the IHS began providing contraceptive services in the 60s, IHS doctors began sterilizing indigenous women without their full consent. Sometimes they would lie and say a procedure was reversible. Other times they would bury a sterilization consent form in a stack of other paperwork, or they would bring the form to a Native woman when she was partially anesthetized for a different procedure and tell her to sign the paper without telling her what it was. Other times they would coerce her into signing by threatening to withdraw health care or other welfare benefits. Many times they would simply do the procedure with no consent and only tell her about it afterwards, or just not tell her at all. The incidence of involuntary sterilization increased dramatically after 1970 with the passage of the Population Research Act, which subsidized sterilization procedures for Medicaid patients, i.e. poor women, and IHS patients, i.e. Native women. Thousands of indigenous women in the 60s and especially 70s went into their doctors for a routine checkup and came out sterilized. The doctors and nurses performing these procedures, government employees who did these procedures on government funds, did it because they were racist. They did not believe indigenous women should have more children, nor did they think they were smart or responsible enough to use normal contraceptives. Thankfully, public pressure led to a revision in medical consent regulations in 1979, which now makes it much more difficult to perform a sterilization without full prior consent. But in the years before this change, anywhere between 25 and 42% of all Indigenous American women of childbearing age were sterilized. including minors as young as 11. As their ancestors had done time and time again, when faced with the colonial onslaught of the termination era, Indigenous people fought back. Within just a few years of the launch of relocation in 1956, the intended outcome of preventing Indigenous community organizing backfired pretty spectacularly. By cramming Indigenous people from all over the country into metropolitan areas, the government inadvertently created the perfect conditions for natives from different tribal groups to compare notes and realize how they were all getting collectively screwed. Many Indigenous youth were now getting college educations and started organizing within the cities around a pan-Indigenous identity. In the milieu of the civil rights movement, the Red Power movement burst onto the scene, advocating for Indigenous rights. Where Black and Latino activists largely advocated for greater integration within American society, Indigenous activists fought for their recognition as distinct political entities and pushed for greater Indigenous control over Indigenous lands. Self-determination and tribal sovereignty were their aims. Some activists took the peaceful protest route, but others, especially the American Indian Movement or AIM, a more militant route. Among the numerous direct actions of the time were the occupation of Alcatraz Island in 1969, the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972, and an armed standoff with the FBI at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1973. This was also the era of the Fish Wars, where activists in the Pacific Northwest and the Great Lakes fought to exercise their treaty-reserved fishing rights free from state interference. The conflict culminated in the 1974 Bolt decision and the 1983 Voigt decision, two of the major treaty rights-affirming cases of U.S. history. After years of opposition from Native people and tribal governments, the termination and relocation policies were abandoned in 1970, being replaced with the modern era of federal Indian policy oriented around tribal self-determination. The U.S. government would no longer terminate federal recognition of tribes, and ostensibly, treaty rights and obligations would now be upheld. The change wasn't a silver bullet, and tribes have still had to fight for every assertion of their rights and sovereignty since, but they have gained ground. For tribes who had been terminated, regaining recognition is, by design, extremely difficult. However, some, like the Menominee, have achieved it. Likewise, though the US government is still extremely reluctant to give stolen land back to Native nations, it has actually done so. Blue Lake in northern New Mexico made history when it was returned to Taos Pueblo in 1970. This was the first time the United States had ever returned stolen Native land, and thankfully, it has not been the last. One of the major post-termination land deals was the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA, of 1971. In 1871, only 4 years after buying Alaska from Russia, the US officially abandoned the practice of making treaties with Native nations. Consequently, there are no treaties between the US and any Alaskan Native nation. The federal government acknowledged Aboriginal title in Alaska, but made no mechanism in the law for Alaska Natives to secure title to their lands, nor for them to legally transfer that title to non-natives. But this didn't stop the state of Alaska from issuing deeds and titles to non-natives for Alaskan land. A handful of small reservations in the Alaska Panhandle were established by Congress or executive order over the years, but this still left well over 99% of the land in Alaska as a legally unceded Indigenous territory. Thus, ANCSA was passed in 1971 to sort this whole mess out. As of the date of this video, it is the largest land claim settlement in US history. In a true example of just how capitalist American society is, the idea we conjured of how to recognize Alaska Native tribes as distinct political entities with sovereignty over land was to organize them legally as corporations. Yep, I am not joking. Legally, Alaska tribal citizens are shareholders of a tribal corporation. A little over 1/8 of Alaska's land, about 44 million acres, was set aside as Alaska Native Corporation lands, and $960 million was divided among the 13 regional corporations and over 200 village corporations in compensation for the remaining 321 million acres that was now officially ceded to non-native control. The Act also established Alaska Native as a distinct identity in American law, separate from American Indian, which is the legal term used for natives of the lower 48. Most of the communities that had been granted a reservation accepted the provisions of ANCSA, which involved dissolving their reservations. However, the Metlakatla Indian community did not, leaving one remaining reservation in the entire state of Alaska, the Annette Island Indian Reserve. Through the 90s and early 2000s, many tribes across the country exercised their sovereignty and started opening tribal businesses, with many moving into the casino business. There have been some spectacular economic successes for gaming tribes, but to dispel any rumors, it has not been a guarantee of instant prosperity. Only about a third of tribes operate any sort of gaming venture, and of those who do, most are making only a modest profit. Indigenous people are not swimming in cash because of any special privileges. A notable recent victory for tribal sovereignty is the McGirt decision of 2020. About half the land of the state of Oklahoma is, by treaty, Indigenous reservation land. Now, due to decades of white settlement and policies from the federal government and the state of Oklahoma, tribes have not been able to exert their authority over all that land that is theirs by treaty. And as far as Oklahoma is concerned, the vast majority of that land isn't reservation land anymore, but state land. However, in 2020, the Supreme Court sided with Oklahoma's tribes and recognized that all of that treaty-reserved land was never disestablished, meaning 40% of Oklahoma is still what's legally called Indian country. The full ramifications of this decision will take years to hash out, but it's probably the most significant vindication of treaty rights in recent memory. This last topic has no easy introduction, but it needs to be addressed. One of the greatest problems facing Indigenous people today, in both the United States and Canada, is the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Because of America's long history of eating away at tribal sovereignty, tribal governments have an extremely hard time enforcing the law against non-native criminals. This was accentuated especially by the 1978 case Oliphant v. Suquamish, in which the Supreme Court ruled that tribal governments have no jurisdiction over non-native perpetrators, even when they commit crimes on tribal land. Severe crimes like murder and rape are supposed to be prosecuted by the FBI, but frankly, they don't give a shit, and are slow and downright lazy in responding to crimes in Indian country. As a result, non-native, mainly white, predators know they can go onto native land, assault and murder Indigenous women, and be pretty much guaranteed to get away with it. Indigenous women are over twice as likely to experience violence as any other demographic in the United States, and 10 times more likely to be murdered than the national murder rate. 1/3 of all Indigenous women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and in some areas, 96% of the perpetrators are non-native. It is extremely difficult to find reliable statistics on how many Indigenous women are missing or murdered in the US because the DOJ's records are woefully inadequate, but one study in 2016 calculated the number of known incidents at over 5,700. Fortunately, there are some truly badass Indigenous women leading the charge to solve this issue, and I will link some resources down in the description if you want to learn more. Indigenous Americans have been through a long and enduring history. There have been periods of prosperity, incredible ingenuity and human flourishing, and a long, hard struggle against the onslaught of colonialism. But Indigenous people are still here today. Despite the best that an entire continent of empires could throw at them for over 500 years, Indigenous people are alive and well, reviving their cultures, determining their futures, and asserting their places in the world. They have formed an indelible part of the American landscape since time immemorial, and will continue to do so long into the future. Thank you all for watching. If you like this content and want to learn more, do like, subscribe, and hit that notification button to stay in the loop. Also, I would love to hear in the comments what topics of Indigenous history you want me to cover. I do have my own plans for the direction of the channel, but I would love to see what topics you in the audience want to learn more about, and I will occasionally veer off my video schedule to accommodate an audience suggestion. I look forward to reading your responses, and I will see you all next time.